Okay, so it's just about 7, so I'm going to get started, and those who haven't joined us yet will in just a minute. So good evening, everyone, and welcome to Broadview's National Online Reading Club. My name is Emma Prestwich, and I'm Broadview's Digital and United Church and Focus Editor. If you haven't met her yet, working behind the scenes to help me out is Aisha Habib, who is Broadview's Associate Editor. And we're so glad that you've taken an hour from your evening to be here with us. This evening, I'm speaking to you from the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Huron-Wendat, the original owners and custodians of this land. Today, Toronto is home to many, including a diverse urban Indigenous community of Inuit, First Nations, and Métis. We'd love to know who you are and where you're from, so if you have a chance to, please say hello from your hometown in the chat space. And if you're part of a faith community and want to add that as well, please do so. And if you want to add your own land acknowledgement from wherever you are, I invite you to share that as well. And a few housekeeping notes for those who haven't joined us before. We are recording this session so we can share this event with others later. So if you're at all uncomfortable with your video appearing on the recording, please turn it off now. And please keep your audio muted. There will be a chance in the event to ask questions of our presenters, but if you're not asking a question, please keep yourself on mute. This evening, we're going to hear from William Marquand, Gullion Stewart, and David Kim-Cragg, all of whom contributed to the December 2024 issue of Broadview. And as I mentioned, there will be a chance to ask questions. Aisha will post instructions on how to do that in the chat space. And I have some ready for our guests, but we'll have a more vibrant conversation if there's lots of participation. Our first guest is William Marquand. William, or Bill, practices architecture in St. Louis and has degrees from the Georgia Institute of Technology and Yale University. He is also on the board of the Friends of First Church in Berkeley. He wrote The Glass Sanctuary in our December issue about how more transparent sanctuary spaces would also better integrate the people inside those spaces with the society around them. Welcome, William.
Okay.
There we go.
There we go. Good to be here.
Thank you so much. And feel free to, if there are some thoughts about your story that you wanted to share, feel free, and then we'll have some questions afterwards.
Certainly. Okay. Oh, you would like me to start out then? I'm happy to.
That would be wonderful. If there are other details from the story that you didn't get a chance to share, things you didn't get to include, or other themes that came up for you while you were writing it.
Sure. Well, let me tell you a little bit of the genesis of it. I decided long ago to study this building as part of a postgraduate program, and I was very interested in churches as part of my architectural studies. And I originally wanted to do 3 famous American churches, basically, one East Coast, Midwest, and then on the West Coast. Then I decided just to narrow it down. There's really, a set number of really amazing and famous, well respected churches in the U.S. And I think probably perhaps most well known is Trinity in Boston, and then Unity Temple and Chicago, Frank Lloyd Wright. And on the West Coast, it's a much younger culture, but the Maybeck Church is pretty well known out there. And I happen to be a Christian Scientist, and it happened the building itself had not been studied very thoroughly in the past, so I just took that on. When I first visited the place, I noticed the glass. I kind of thought of it as a kind of a great design move, and I think that's generally how it's discussed in the literature. But as I've aged and as I've thought about the building more and more, I think it has a lot more to do with transparency and the kind of radicalness of being able to sit in a sanctuary and notice and feel and sense the people and culture outside of you and around you. I had my first real interest in studying sanctuaries was a senior year in Paris, and I looked at a number of churches there, modern churches mainly, but so I kind of started developing an idea of what a sanctuary was like, what the atmosphere was like. I've always kind of had an experiential appreciation for architecture, and that's kind of like the idea of how do spaces make us feel, how you could take a constructional approach to architecture where you're thinking about beams and concrete versus wood or whatever, but you can also take an experiential view, which is how does I'm a human being, how do I adapt and experience this space? So in that light, I've always thought that Berkeley was a lot more remarkable than it's kind of made out to be, even though it's an extremely beautiful building. It was built by Bernard Maybeck, and he was, like many turn of the century architects, a graduate of the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, and he knew how to make beautiful historic looking buildings like other architects in the of his time. But beyond that, he was willing to talk his congregation into something quite crazy. It was to surround his congregation with glass. Glass was not considered a worthy material to sheathe a church in at that time, and it was certainly not uh, something you'd normally experience in a church. Of course, you have big windows in churches, and some of them were sort of translucent, and you could sort of see people beyond them. But the idea of making the whole bottom floor, the whole human floor, that's the space surrounded and translucent glass, and where you could see people and walking by outside, and they could kind of see you from outside, and that was pretty crazy. Over the years, as I kind of dabbled in the history of this church, I've just sort of realized, but I've never really had a chance to write about this building in that light. And I really, really appreciate working with Broadview to bring out this article, because I've not only are they kind of interested in, sort of cutting edge ideas of what worship spaces and worship is like, but they were willing to put some pages into this and really be able to illustrate with photographs what was going on with this place. So um, I really wanted to make the article about it's about a topical issue, which is the idea of bubbles, and are we constricting our view of the world? Are we needlessly kind of like reflecting our own image of what we like back at us when we look out the walls of a church, or are we kind of seeing beyond that? Or are we seeing the enormous creation that we experience and is described in the Bible or in science textbooks or whatever you want to call it? But there's just a big world out there, and this church is kind of points us to include that big world in our understanding of creation. So that's kind of my thesis behind the article. And it's not a very common thesis for articles about churches. So I'm very interested in what other people might have to say about it. And I'm so glad that we're having this discussion group where there's a good bit of time devoted to question and answers. So I appreciate Broadview for putting this on.
Oh, and thank you so much. I mean, Alana Mitchell, who's our features editor, is the one that you worked with on this, and she's the
Correct.
one who helped craft it alongside you. But I know for the rest of us, and I'm sure for her as well, it spoke to us because we often have stories about what it means to be church and how do you do that beyond the metaphorical walls of your building. So I think this spoke to how the architecture can either aid or hinder that. I wanted to ask you about some of the practical considerations of spaces like this. I know that brick and stone were the materials that were used in the time that many of these spaces were constructed. Um, and so glass could certainly be considered. But I know effectively they also ensure some longevity for those buildings. Are there concerns about glass in terms of if you built a church now that was largely made of glass? I know there have been a lot of advancements in that material. Um,
Right.
would it last for quite as long?
That's a good question. One nice thing about brick and stone, especially brick, it's considered unit masonry, which is if one piece fails or something like that, you take it out and put it back in, and um, take some grout and all that stuff and mortar and make it work. But glass is a different item because you need basically manufactured pieces that are a certain size and match look. And in fact, the church is going to run into that problem when they restore those glass walls. They're going to have to go to some length to match that glass. So it is a little bit of a maintenance issue. One thing nice about it, it's extremely stable material. It doesn't have problems with expansion and so forth that other materials might have. But it does, obviously, it cracks much easier than brick and stone. If bottles are thrown at it, you can have damage you got to deal with. And in fact, the church happened to be right next to People's Park in the 1960s, and that was where there were a lot of demonstrations in Berkeley, and there were some windows that had to be fixed. That may not have been a problem if it had been a different material. So it has its ups and downs, but it's a I mean, look, just go down the street now. These days, you'll see glass everywhere. In fact, it's hard to find a building that isn't large amounts of glass. So it's a common endeavor. There have been, since I started writing this article, there's been remarkable buildings and even churches and sanctuaries built with glass. Uh, um, so it's not that a strange of an endeavor to build with glass, and but obviously, as I kind of point out in the article, that there certainly aren't many sanctuaries that it's considered for.
You rightly point out the ubiquity of glass in so many other forms of construction. Do you have an opinion on why that has become so common?
Well, boy, that's a good question. It's really very closely associated with the modern movement in architecture, and one reason is that I mean, we like to see things. We like to, we pay a lot of money for beautiful views out of our houses, to situate our houses next to nice landscapes and things like that, or our apartments in downtown that have nice windows. And so it's considered a nicety. It's considered we're safe and sound behind this glass. We've got comfort, temperature control space there. And yet we get to see a vast array of what's going on in front of us. And that's it's a nice feeling. So I think it has a couple of, partly to do with modernism, which was emerging. And in fact, Maybach's building is kind of considered to be proto-modern. So he was a little bit on the forefront of that. And it's also one thing the modern movement was able to do is its work with structure allows for large expanses of open glass, whereas before when we had traditional building and brick and stone buildings that were they had to hold up the building. Well, you had much more narrow spaces, and that's partly why traditional architecture has much less expansive glass and openings in it.
Sure. So it's pretty common in commercial, in some residential, I feel like construction as well. I see glass, huge panels
Sure.
uh,
Yes,
in front
yes.
of homes, but it's still not very common in churches. For faith communities who are reading this article and are thinking, "Wow, I love the idea behind that, but we don't have the money right now to undertake some large scale construction."
Mhm.
Are there smaller ways that churches, other sanctuaries could revamp their spaces to better include folks outside?
No, that's a good question. There's a lot of churches with windows, and a lot of churches have, for example, sill heights on those windows, the bottom level of those windows that are maybe 5 or 6 feet tall. You could, without a lot of structural effort, extend those windows down. And while it's not cheap to mess around with windows, it's also a lot less expensive than additions or other, building other walls or popping out the building. Um, you know, I think that I think one thing I wanted to do with this article was not to set this as kind of a paradigm of how everybody should build a church. And what I really was hoping to do is what I address in the final paragraphs is to just break this monopoly of the idea that we can't have a sanctuary. It's just not right to have a sanctuary that's semi-public like this, even though in this particular church you can't really identify anybody on either side of the glass from the other side. So it does maintain a good bit of privacy, but I think the idea is when we go into a worship space and we look around at the walls, which generally, walls are kind of statements, and that's why we go into beautiful, traditional buildings, and we see paintings of the apostles or um, religious figures here and there on the walls. We're kind of reflecting our own beliefs back at us, and we're kind of trying to learn from our own beliefs. They're also educational. I don't want to make it sound like it's just we're just kind of being monocultural or anything like that. But my point is that maybe it's time where we really considered that outside world that we're previously kind of escaping from as part of our world and part of the world that needs the healing that our teachings bring to it, and have reminders of that while we're sitting in the service and while we're doing that. So um, I think the idea is just to experiment, to see, how can we do this? Or if we do want to remodel our church in some way, or make it look more up to date, or show others that this congregation is alive and we're doing things, that there are really opportunities for that. And one thing I didn't dwell on it much, but I talk about in the article, is how other people are able to see into the building, and that's a key thing. Commercial architecture, for example, consider that highly important, to be able to penetrate for somebody outside to penetrate that wall and see what's going on inside, so that you kind of feel safe. You kind of have an agreement. I'm going to go into this building, and this is what I'm going to find. And that helps that helps any kind of endeavor where a building represents that undertaking, and you go in the door and you had a preview of what you're going to find there. For new people entering a building for the first time, that's just a nice thing, and it has a kind of warmth and welcome feel to people on the outside that these stone, these large expanses of stone just can't match.
No, it's very true. And I know that for you, this story really melded two things that are important to you, your work as an architect and also your faith and your interest in
Mhm.
how churches interact with the rest of the world. But in your work as an architect, are there, and I'm sure you've been asked to design a variety of different spaces, are there philosophies that you use design wise in creating in designing the structures that you do?
Well, sure. There's every profession has its multitude of philosophies and approaches. And basically, if you're an engineer or a doctor or an architect or whatever, you have your own approach and you've kind of used it in the past. I personally, I love both things. I'm kind of a little bit like Maybeck. I love the history that we see, um, you know, going far back, just I love all of architectural history. But one thing I know about architectural history is a lot of what makes great buildings are pioneers. They're people who are willing to see the world around them and interpret the contemporary world using the stuff that we got to build with. And that's kind of the attitude Maybeck took. He said, "Well, we've got factory windows. I mean, who would have thought to put factory windows around a church? And you couldn't get away with it on the East Coast, probably. I'll say that it was something probably not many places other than Berkeley you could get away with it, but it just ended up being so beautiful. So I sort of feel that there's a modern and traditional ways of looking at things, but uh, and it is an art, it's kind of an art, so you do have to have your kind of own artistic approach.
Oh, modern and traditional is a wonderful segue. Thank you so much, Bill. I
You're
really
welcome. My
appreciate
pleasure.
so great. Wonderful to be able to read the story that you wrote and also to hear more about your interest in it and the work you do. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
So our next guest, who also tries to meld uh, some traditional methods of art with modern ones as well, is our next guest, Kim Gullion Stewart. Kim is a Métis artist and educator and a member of the Métis Nation of British Columbia. She has a diverse portfolio. She has done an incredible variety of things, um, everything from mixed media beadwork pieces and blankets to comic illustrations and even Canada Post stamps. So you will see Kim's art in the illustration for David Kim-Cragg story, Who Made the Birch Bark Talk, which explores the differing origin stories of what in English is called the Cree writing system and what speakers call spirit markers. So please join me in welcoming Kim.
Thank you so much, Emma. Yeah, my name is Kim Gullion Stewart. Gullion is my maiden name, and that is the name that connects me to the historical Métis Nation from Red River. I was born in Athabasca, Alberta, and I'm living in Spruce Grove, Alberta right now, but I spent a lot of time in British Columbia. I've been a visual artist, graphic designer, illustrator, and educator for over 30 years. And I really enjoyed doing the illustration for the magazine. I enjoy being able to highlight areas that the authors are writing about. I think one of the things that connected me to this particular article, aside from also having a connection through a Cree nation, is the fact that oftentimes in the past we have Western representations of different subject matters, but not often have we had Indigenous voices come in and be able to basically talk about how they feel about a particular article or map or vintage piece, such as a novel and whatnot. And I know that Indigenous heritage and Indigenous identity, First Nations, Métis and Inuit, is of a lot of interest and has featured a lot in some of our pop culture from as far back as the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. And so as a way to explore my identity, because I had to kind of hide that, especially as a young person. My parents encouraged me to hide that so that I wouldn't experience the kind of racism that especially my dad had experienced when he was younger. And so I didn't really know how much of what I knew about being a Métis person was connected to things that my family had taught me, and how much of it was connected to, say, pop culture, like movies, movie representations and novels and writing and whatnot. And so one of the ways in which I explore that is a technique called counter mapping. And that is, and you can see in the background here an example here as well. This is off of a Western novel about a half-breed hero. And I've put an Indigenous beaded flower on there. And so what I do is considered to be counter mapping, which is basically a grassroots way of putting another voice on top of something that might be a map or a political border or a poster of some sort. And well, here, I'll just read. It says here, counter mapping is map making, charting of stories, pathways, and culture by making marks of resistance on top of a Western representation of land, such as a map. It can challenge Western ideas around boundaries, possession, economic pathways, and culture. And with counter mapping, what I've done, I started out actually mapping on the Dent School Atlas from the 1950s. So those would be the maps that were used, some of them even in residential school teachings. So I started putting beadwork on there as a way to say, hey, we were here during this time, and this is how we feel about that. And I just want to switch over to the Broadview article now about the birch bark and how this all relates. Métis, especially floral beadwork, is something that is very important to Métis culture, in being that florals and plants of different kinds have deep meaning. And for example, the flower that I used on the illustration that I did for the magazine is a wild rose. And wild roses are thought to be representational of family and loyalty and protection, especially when you think about the thorns on the end of the rose. And so I thought it was appropriate. And also they're considered to be matriarchal. So a lot of times the women in a family would have particular floral beadwork that was connected directly to their family, what they did for a living, and who they were within their culture. So I thought it was important to put a floral beadwork matriarch flower in the illustration that I had done. And in that illustration, I also included some birch bark. I included a star chart, which has is basically shaped like a star, and it had a number of the syllabics in a particular order, and it was used to help students learn pronunciation and use of the syllabics rather quickly. So they're arranged in a particular way. I thought that really talked about how important the syllabics were as a form of communication, written communication between different cultures. So that was something that I included. I also had in the background, I had included a screenshot or a photograph of the 1841 page out of a hymnal that had syllabics in it as well. And those syllabics, by the way, there's numerous different ones, and they're kind of accredited to, I guess they've evolved over time. So these ones from 1841, and you may see a bit of them in the illustration. Some of them were solid, they might be a solid rectangle, and some of them had little interruptions. It almost looks like a mistake in printing. So the triangle will be not completely whole. There'll be like a gap missing. But actually, those gaps are there intentionally, and they're meant to help the person visualize and pronounce just slightly different. We don't see that in some of the modern ways of representing those syllabics, but I thought it was an important connection to the story and the history of how these were used, and how people had collaborated together to bring them forward as a way to communicate in the hymnals, and a variety of other written materials. What else? What else was I hoping to tell you guys about this? Oh yeah, I did want to say that I have illustrated for the magazine before, and it was just such an honor to be asked to illustrate again. I had no idea that I had so many friends that read the magazine. And of course, after the illustration came out, I got to connect with cousins and friends that I hadn't heard from for a while, as they were messaging me and saying, "Oh, I saw your illustration in the article." So that was really exciting. And one of the really nice things about, creating an illustration, not only are you supporting the writer, but it also gives you a way to connect to readers in a visual manner as well. So that's what I have to say about that.
Thank you so much, Kim. And I mean, the illustration is just as much the story. Thank you so much for going through the different pieces of it, and what you brought, why you brought those different pieces there.
Sure.
You mentioned beadwork and how prominent it is in your art. What are the challenges in working with that particular medium? Do you find it pretty fiddly? I'm just thinking of working with a bunch of tiny beads and not being the most coordinated. What are the challenges in working with that medium?
Well, just like with every trade or thing that we do with our hands, you have to have the right tool for the job. And so definitely having the right size needle for the size of beads is very, very important. And when I first started beading, I would always pick a needle that was too thick. And then of course your beads get stuck, and you can't get them to slide on carefully. Additionally to that, there's kind of like methods of uh, applying beads onto fabric that don't apply to paper. And so I've kind of switched over to things like paper and doilies. I've done what I call duets, where I get a doily that's been made by oftentimes an anonymous woman from the past, a beautiful artisan and a beautiful piece. And I want to add my appreciation by way of beadwork. And so we end up doing a duet, kind of like some of the older music. I think it was Johnny Cash and his daughter did or maybe I don't know who it was. One of the singers did a duet with his daughter after he had passed away. They were able to put her voice over top, and I guess I think about that and how I can add a contemporary voice. But when you're working with these older papers and older doilies and fabrics, they're very fragile. And so I'm always afraid to rip or tear or spoil the original map because, of course, I don't want to destroy it in any way. I want to add my voice to what I've seen. And especially with, say, the dent school atlases that we had here in Canada. The paper's pretty good because it has what's called a rag content, which is a little bit of cotton in there, something that paper doesn't often have now. But then all the fingers, people used to lick their fingers and turn the page on paper, and so it gets fragile and it gets oils from people's hands on it. So you have to be very careful, when I'm stitching through not to tear it.
And some of these older maps and these atlases and these older elements that you're adding onto, how are you sourcing some of those? Do you have folks who like to collect old archival materials, or how do you find them and how do you choose the right one for the project you're putting together?
That's such a good question, Emma. Thank you. I have always loved vintage pieces, vintage posters and vintage maps. And actually, my dad, and maybe this is where it came from, my dad was actually a projectionist a long time ago. And we always got the old movie posters. My dad, we leased a drive-in theater, and it was his responsibility to go and pick up the posters and the cases for the films and things and bring them over to the theater and set them up. And I used to love the artwork that was on those Gone with the Wind, and all those really old big posters. I absolutely adored them. And I guess because they evoke an emotional feeling for me. And the maps and the like this piece that's in behind me do the same thing. When I'm holding an old book that somebody's been reading, and you can tell how well it's been loved because the corners are all kind of ripped and torn. I really admire and feel like I'm connected to those generations farther back. And so I do a lot of my own sourcing. I go to, I've traveled out to Vancouver Island, and every time I travel somewhere, even with my husband, we have to stop and look at the different vintage stores. I keep my eyes open for things. The other day, I found a beautiful McCall's pattern from the 1950s, and the woman who had used it, it was for making flowers. And she had her handwriting, meet on Saturday, Mrs. Andrews, and everything on there. And I wondered about that. Like, who is Mrs. Andrews? Were they meeting about the flowers? So that sort of thing really gets me excited. And sometimes people find something and they'll say, "Hey, I thought of you," and they gift it to me. But yeah,
Oh, it sounds like it's a fun process.
it definitely is.
You talk a little bit, you were talking a little bit about counter mapping, and you've also written a little bit about how your art is a way of getting at your own identity a little bit.
Mm.
Um, and I mean, this story, some of this involves digging, the story that you illustrated involves kind of digging through archives to find meaning and truth. And you talk about your art as a way to do that. How has how has the art that you have created, how has that helped you find your identity as a Métis person?
Oh, I've learned so much. One of the things that I was asked to do early in my academic career, I taught post-secondary for 19 years, and I'm retired from it now. But I was asked to create university level classes, two of them, about Métis identity, because one of the things that's kind of been missing in the last 10, 15 years is the finer details about who are Métis people. Are you, if you're half this or half that, or if you've a great, great, great granny who was Cree, are you Métis, right? So people have a lot of questions and they often don't understand how someone who walks between two cultures, my mom was a settler, her family was from the Ukraine, and then my dad was Métis, and he had Métis ancestors, a Cree ancestor, and his mom was Polish. So people don't understand, how does this make a new culture? But basically, with Métis, they created their own language, their own artwork, their own dances, their own separate foods. So they are a culture that was born in Canada, a very young culture that was born in Canada as a result of two, strong and talented groups of people coming together, newcomers from across the ocean and the Indigenous people that lived here. Their families in the beginning, they got together and intermarried and made just a beautiful new culture out of the things that were meaningful for them. And so in doing this beadwork, I've had to do a lot of research. I've got a lot of diaries and journals that I've gone through, things that were written by, say, soldiers that were part of the Louis Riel resistance. And so you can read information, soldiers that kept daily logs and things. And so it kind of goes beyond what we normally would see in our everyday walks in terms of what we know about our history. And for me, I won't do an illustration unless I do the research. And of course, with this one for the Broadview magazine, I checked out all the links. I did all the research from what had been written in David's article, and it fascinated me. And so that's how I work. And that's, I guess, how I've learned and grown, was because I do the research. What do things mean and why are they the way they are? And do they have to stay that way? And I guess when it comes to things like reconciliation, we think about reconciliation, and that's a huge word right now. Some people feel comfortable with that word, and other people feel guilty, and other people feel angry. But for me, reconciliation started with myself and reconciling exactly who am I in the community. And then it goes out to, who are we today as people that want to live and grow and be in community with each other going forward, right? So I don't know if that answers the question.
Absolutely, it does. And thank you for being willing to share that. It's beautiful work, and it's so lovely to hear more about. We don't always get to learn more about the beautiful art pieces, and it's wonderful to learn more. I'm
Thank
wondering,
you for
Aisha, if
having
you
me.
can. Oh, sorry, I interrupted you.
No, I just said thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for being here. And the background behind you, that is so neat. And I think I think a great example of some of the work that you do.
Yeah, this is a 1950s novel, and so you can see where this is the actual novel cover, so you can see where somebody loved it a lot. They were hanging on to it by the corner of the book.
It's a wonderful detail. Thank you so much, Kim.
You're welcome.
And now we're going to dive into the written portion of that particular story, and we're going to talk about it a bit with David Kim-Cragg. David is a historian, an author, and a minister. He serves St. Matthew's United in Richmond Hill, Ontario. He wrote Who Made the Birch Bark Talk, and has also written two features for Broadview about the history of its predecessor, the Christian Guardian, and that publication's relationship with Indigenous peoples. Welcome, David.
Thank you very much. Um, yeah, it's wonderful to be here. So I'll say a little bit about the some of the things that were moving me in the process of uh, writing this article. First of all, I find languages fascinating, both spoken and written. Um, they're so foundational to our human experience, and each one shapes our human experience in fundamental ways. And I'm not a gifted linguist or anything by any means, but I have been able to learn some French and some Korean in additional to my mother tongue English. So I had some appreciation of what is being lost with the disappearance and erasure of Indigenous languages in Canada. And for a long time now, I've been looking for opportunities to learn more about those languages. Fortunately, when I was living in Saskatoon, I got an opportunity to learn some Cree, and that is really uh, one of the key genesis moments of this article. When I was first exposed in my Cree classes to the story of Calling Badger, I started to wonder where it was that I learned the missionary version of the creation of the Cree syllabics. And to be honest, I can't remember anyone telling me that story, that history. And I think that I must have been exposed to a pamphlet fairly early on in life, probably laying around my church somewhere. I grew up at St. Andrew's United Church in Sudbury because I had in my head an image of a missionary surrounded by indigenous people, teaching them how to write the syllabics on birch bark, and that was imprinted on my mind. I think that experience of mine and that the way I probably internalized that story goes to show how our perception of history is absorbed from the environment around us, and also how powerful images can be for the conveying of a story. So Kim's image in the article and what we've just heard today just strikes me as absolutely fascinating. And I think people like Kim are able to, in a wonderful way, shape history and our understanding of history, uh, probably in ways far more powerful than they're given credit for. So one thing I didn't expect as I started to work on this article was the difficulty that I would have finding people with expertise on the topic of James Evans, who is the missionary credited with developing the Cree syllabics. It was easier to find people to talk about the indigenous side of the story, actually, than it was somebody to talk about the missionaries side. In the 1990s, the last book was published on James Evans that has been written. There's been a book written about James Evans in every generation since his death. And the 1990s was the last one. There hasn't been any written in this generation, and there doesn't seem to be anybody who's really thinking about him very much from that old missionary perspective. Um, which surprised me, but and I have mixed feelings about. As somebody who studies mission history, I have a great respect for missionaries generally. Um, they were biased. They contributed to the process of colonization that robbed people of their land and cultures. But I don't feel they were any more guilty of these sins than others of their age. And in fact, I don't think they're any more guilty of these sins than many who hold power and influence today. And where I find them very fascinating is that they were often exposed or exposed themselves to to cultures in a way that very few people do, from one culture exposing themselves to another. Um, they put themselves in situations of vulnerability. They exposed themselves to hardship. They crossed cultural lines, and many of them were able to learn important things about cultural difference and to impart what they learned to the church and society from which they came. So things that we have learned from missionaries, Canadian society in general, I think, has made it much easier to come to terms with the injustices of colonialism and to start to change things for the better. Flawed though they were, I think they have imparted us something worth studying. James Evans was, from what I can tell, a very humble man. He came from a privileged background, but he and his wife and child lived with very little money. He was dedicated to his work of teaching. He was curious, energetic, thoughtful, and sincere. And there is no written proof that he himself claimed to have invented the Cree syllabics. His, uh, his word was that he prepared them. So it was people who wrote about him for their churches who claimed that he invented them single-handedly, and that wasn't James Evans' take on it at all. So, long story short, we have entered into a new age of history where the missionary version of things is going out the window, so to speak, in favor of a much more collaborative view. And this is a very good thing. We are no longer fighting about who is right and wrong, but looking for examples of how to live together, which I think was part, maybe not the first thing that missionaries were looking to do, but part of what they were after too. And I particularly appreciate the research of the Cree historian Samara Harp, who did not make it into this piece, but who I was able to communicate with in the process of writing it. She's worked and published some stuff online, and she has come to the conclusion that Cree syllabics were a team effort between Indigenous people who worked closely with James Evans and James Evans himself. And I really respect that conclusion that she's come to. As I point out in my piece, there are actually some very curious agreements in both the Indigenous version and the missionary version of the story, that they were both the product of people with an openness to the work of the Spirit and committed to the betterment of others, and that they both first inscribed the syllabics on the bark of a birch tree. And so that's what I wanted to say this evening.
Thank you very much, David. It's, oh, I want to leave time for some folks to ask some questions. We have a few minutes here. I wanted to touch on something that you said at the beginning, which was about finding it difficult to locate information about James Evans. And you've done a few stories for Broadview that involve diving into a lot of archival material, some that is a little difficult to read and parse and understand. Can you talk a little bit about the challenges that you've encountered when working with really dated text?
Well, one of the big challenges, and this I think applies to folks who want to look into the past and understand it generally, is that in every age you have people writing and expressing themselves from uh, a perspective that is a little bit foreign from the one that we inhabit today. So there are many things in the written in the Christian Guardian, for example, where some of James Evans' exploits were covered. James Evans actually published some things in the Guardian as well. And so I think the trick is um, to recognize bias, things that we have grown out of, perspectives that we no longer adhere to, and for good reasons, and to try to find an appreciation for the person and the work that they're doing and the environment in which they find themselves, that we can still relate to today. That's not always easy. It's easier to get set off by dated language, by use of expressions of or characterizations of people that we find offensive. Um, Missionaries are prone to talk about savages and things like that. Um, but at the same time, they're intimately involved with people very, very different from themselves, and often learning things and absorbing things and uh, and thinking about things that are very important still for us as we try to navigate cultural difference. So that's one of the things, just to try to place oneself in a different historic context, to try sometimes to read between the lines when somebody says something that seems negative about another culture or another people. um, we can, with a little bit of research, reconstruct the position that the person who's writing about them is taking offense to, and reconstruct that in a more positive way, to appreciate the kind of dialogue going on. Um, and I think we can come to a much better understanding that way.
I mean, it's certainly interesting work, and I mean, the story is really really sheds light on a topic that I don't think I knew much of anything about. And I think for many of our readers, learning more about Cree-syllabics, um, and I think for me to be able to actually see some of them and in the story was really meaningful as well. Thank you so much, David. I really appreciate it. It was really great to have two lenses to understand this story through you and through Kim.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. So thank you so much to our presenters and to all of you for being here. Before we wrap up, I wanted to give a couple of minutes to Tricia Elliott, who is our executive director, who would love a chance just to chat with all of you. Take it away, Tricia.
Well, first, I want to apologize to Kim. Kim, as you were talking, I was getting a note together with some links in it, and I accidentally, my pinky finger slipped, and I posted it while you were speaking, and I didn't intend to do that. So I apologize if you were watching the chat and saw that completely unrelated post come up. Thank you for being here tonight. I wanted to share a couple of things with you, and you can look back in the chat earlier than what I had meant to post, but if you were watching that, there are a couple of links that I shared with you. As you know, we are in the midst of a postal strike, and we are certainly hoping that, for a fair resolution for all. As a charity and one that it involves a magazine, a print and mailed magazine, it certainly is having an impact on our operations and our end of year fundraising and revenue driving efforts. So two things. If you're a print subscriber, we have been trying to connect with you in various ways, sending letters before the strike and emails as we can and through group reps, etc., to enable us to connect with you so that we can send you a digital PDF of the magazine. We're hoping to send it on Wednesday to everyone who fills out a form online that will help us link your subscription accounts with your email address. So I've put the link there for that form. And if you filled that out, you're a subscriber, we'll send you out the digital PDF. We'll do it Wednesday, and then we'll send it again in a couple of weeks. And if you're able to share it with people in your community of faith who also are subscribers, that would be helpful to us. And then we plan to mail the print magazine as soon as we're able. And then I also wanted to let you know that the strike will have an impact on our bottom line, as we are seeing already a drop in gift subscriptions and obviously a drop in donations, because many of our donors rely on the reminder from the direct mail campaign to donate. So if you're planning to make your annual donation at this time of year, please don't wait to get our letter in the mail. It would be a good time to give online if you can. And of course, this year, 3 generous donors have come together to match all donations up to an amazing amount, $210,000, our biggest match ever. So, thank you. Appreciate your support and your flexibility and patience as we work through these issues and do our best to get you your magazine in some way, shape, or form when you're expecting it. I'm happy to answer any questions about either of those things if you have them. I'll just wait and see if anybody posts in the chat, Emma. Doesn't look like it. Thank you all. Emma, do you want to wrap up?
For sure. Thanks so much, Tricia. And thank you to all of you for being here. This was really, really wonderful. But most of all, I would really like to thank Kim, David, and William, who volunteered their time to be here tonight. I think we had a theme here, and it wasn't one that I was intending on, historical, traditional, archival, and how to connect it with our context today. So thank you for your wonderful insights. Once we're done tonight, if you'd like to stay for an informal discussion time, any of you are welcome to. It sounds like there's at least one comment request for discussion in the chat. Tomorrow we'll be sending you a short survey by email so you can share your thoughts with us about this event. Otherwise, thank you so much for being here. Be well, and hope to see you back here in January when we'll host a discussion about our January-February issue. Thank you so much. Have a good night. So for folks who are still here, it looks like there was a comment in the chat from John. John, are you still here? Yes, you are. Wonderful. John, do you want to elaborate a little bit on what you meant?
Well, we heard two presentations that talked about culture and art, and I have always considered architecture to be art. So I just thought after listening to those two presentations that Bill might have a comment.
Do you have a comment, Bill? Feel free to unmute yourself.
Sorry.
No, no worries at all.
Yeah, I do. I really enjoyed the article. I think it was the first one I read, other than our own, which I was checking for the very latest edits. And I got a great sense of enjoyment out of it. I was particularly interested in the I guess this isn't really about so much about the art, but about the history of it, and how that there was a kind of I guess a false history of it, of how that came about, and then there's an unraveling of that, and there's an actual history that that went on. And in architecture, there's and of course I'm intimately involved with this. There's a preservation movement in architecture that started in the 60s and 70s, and it has a lot to do with the idea of interpretive work. When you visit a building, for example, there are interpretive exhibits and things like that that explain the history of a building, and you want to kind of engage the audience or your visitors, and you kind of want to put forth a coherent idea or story, and it kind of forces you to have a narrative of the building, and it has there's a need to decide what actually happened, what it meant. Sometimes you might, I think that maybe it's a little bit too much to say that this is what the building means. And here I'm dispensing it to all my visitors and friends here. I think it's kind of delightful to see articles like this that tell the story about the story. The interpretive, kind of an interpretive thing about how we came to understand what we understand about a historical event or trend, or you know, in the case of this, a kind of a language. So that's kind of what I would have to say about it. It's architecture has become much more about, if you're in the tiny little world of historical preservation, which is, you know, a minuscule amount of what architects do, compared to, you know, the amount of building that goes on. I think that there's a historical and interpretive role that architects have only in the last, you know, less than 100 years have had to kind of take on.
Thanks. This is in the whole urban planning concept of a sense of place, which you're probably familiar with, yeah, which is creating a sense of place. And we often don't look at our buildings like they are a place in the neighborhood. They have a story.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes, yes. I
Thanks very
remember,
much.
I think it was Robert Stern who had a series, maybe on PBS or something, called A Sense of Place back in the 80s.
I'm dating myself. Yep. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.
Historical preservation is so interesting, and how to, you see some really interesting examples of churches and other communities trying to maintain some element of the historical space and try to, you know, make it more open, try to modernize it. It's I'm sure it's difficult to maintain both of those pieces.
Well, it certainly is. I think one problem that all churches now have is that there are just too many of them, and for the amount of users and people that use them, and so yeah, there's people are selective about you know, what gets funded and what doesn't, and that kind of forces you to get a sense of significance, find the significance of this building. And I really, you know, I think really valuable histories are probably behind most buildings. So I think that I think it's important for us to strive to do that kind of hard historical work.
Very much so. What is the legacy of this place?
Oh, yeah, this place being.
Oh, the building, the sort of building writ large that you're talking about. You know, what is the but I suppose whichever building we're in, whether
Yeah,
it's here.
right. Well, one nice thing about churches is they really represent people coming together for some reason, a very important reason, and not only coming together, but willing to shell out a lot of money to build these things, to house, you know, I think it's important to tell stories of why they, you know, why these ideas were important to them. And I think in that way, churches, I just think it's a great thing when we can preserve churches. I'm sure that your, you know, your audience is quite familiar with that challenge.
Certainly is. What to do with our buildings? It's an ongoing question for so many.
Yes, yeah.
Thank you so much, Bill. Are there
You're
other
welcome.
questions or other comments that folks have before we wrap up? If not, that's a nice note to end on. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a wonderful night.
Good night.